Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another Legion class guide. This is an ongoing series where I go over the core gameplay of each class and spec in the Legion Alpha, and sort of give you an idea of how they're played and how their core mechanics work. In this video, we'll be going over the Elemental Shaman. Just like most classes, the Elemental Shaman saw some big changes in Legion. One of their biggest changes is that you're no longer on the mana system. Instead, you're on a new resource called Maelstrom. Think of it like the Shadow Priest's new Insanity system. You have spells that generate Maelstrom power, and other spells that spend it. A lot of abilities have a range in the amount of Maelstrom power they take to cast, and the more Maelstrom power you spend on them, the more damaging and effective they'll be. Other than that, the core gameplay is similar to that of Draenor's. You channel the power of the elements to take down your foes, focusing mainly on fire, lightning, and frost spells. The burst is quite insane, which is the standard for shamans, so we can get really deadly really quickly. And just a disclaimer before we begin, the Shaman is not my main class on Live. I did a lot of training on both Live and Legion to get a solid understanding of how Elemental Spec plays and how it's changed for Legion, but keep in mind that this is from a casual Shaman's perspective. Just something to remember when I talk about a spell or give my opinion on something. And by all means, if you catch any errors, feel free to let me know so I can patch them up with an annotation. Also keep in mind that what you're about to see in this video is all alpha gameplay, so things that you like or don't like are always subject to change. A lot of spells have been changed, removed, or added. I'll go over all of them one by one in the spell book, and I'll also show you them all in action so you can get a good idea of how the spec plays to see if you would like it or not. And I'll sort of go over these in order of importance, putting a higher priority on the bread and butter abilities that make up the core of the elemental spec. And at the end of the video, I'll show you some real fights and narrate them a bit so you can see how all of it comes together. As I'm going through these, keep an eye in the bottom right hand corner of the screen if you want to see the tooltips for the exact numbers and such. Let's start with our Maelstrom generators. First up, we have our classic Lightning Bolt. This is a base 2-second cast spell that deals a medium amount of lightning damage and generates 10 Maelstrom power. Ignore the tooltip, that's just a bug. This unfortunately doesn't generate 16,000 Maelstrom power. That would be pretty impressive considering that the cap is 100. We also still have Chain Lightning. This deals some light nature damage to an enemy and jumps to additional enemies affecting up to 5 targets. It generates 4 Maelstrom per target hit, and it has a 2-second cast time. So just like in Live, this is a really solid AoE spell. Shamans do really well in AoE fights so far this expansion. We have quite the arsenal at our disposal, as you'll see. Next up, we have Lava Burst. This deals about the same damage as a Lightning Bolt. It has seen a nerf. This has the effect to where it'll be a guaranteed critical strike if the target is afflicted by Flame Shock. As you may know, this used to crit regardless if you had Flame Shock on your target or not, and it also lost the effect to where you get 50% more damage if your target is afflicted by Flame Shock. It has a base 2-second cast time, an 8-second cooldown, and it generates 16 Maelstrom. Next, let's go over our Maelstrom spenders. Let's start with Flame Shock. A pretty noteworthy change is that all of our shocks are spammable now. They no longer have cooldowns like they do in Draenor. Flame Shock still deals some instant fire damage and some additional fire damage over time. It costs 0 to 20 Maelstrom, and the more Maelstrom you spend on it, the longer the duration. If you cast it at 0 Maelstrom, it lasts for 15 seconds, and if you cast it at 20 or more, it lasts for 35 seconds. Next up, we have Earth Shock. The range is much bigger for this. This costs anywhere from 10 to 100 Maelstrom and deals damage based on the Maelstrom spent. The damage range is quite large. At its minimum 10 Maelstrom, it deals about half the damage of a single Lightning Bolt, and at 100, it deals about 2.5 times the damage as a Lightning Bolt. Next up, we have Frost Shock. This deals a small amount of frost damage and slows your target's movement speed by 50% for 5 seconds. It costs anywhere from 0 to 20 Maelstrom, so this is spammable, and its damage and duration are increased by up to 100% based on the amount of Maelstrom power spent. One thing that's important to note is that all of these shocks now have a 45-yard range as opposed to the standard 40-yard range, which is a nice little bonus. Next up, we have the Earthquake Totem, which is basically Earthquake from Draenor. It has changed a little bit. This still deals some physical damage to all enemies within 8 yards of its position, and it still has that 10% chance to knock enemies down every time it deals damage. But now it no longer has a cooldown, and it's instant cast. To compensate for that, though, it also costs 40 Maelstrom. So it is now spammable as long as you generate that Maelstrom fast enough. You can stack multiple Earthquakes in the same spot, so you can get some pretty crazy AoE damage going. Next up, we have Healing Surge. This has a base 2-second cast time, it costs 0 to 25 Maelstrom, and it heals your target for a small amount, which is increased depending on how much Maelstrom you spent. Not much to say about this other than right now it seems a little weak compared to the other DPS spec heals. At level 100 with an eye level of 680, it heals for around 6% of your maximum life if you don't spend any Maelstrom on it. So that's around 12% of your max life if you spend the max 25 Maelstrom on it, which I think is a little low considering the cost. And finally, for our Maelstrom spenders, we have Purge. This is the same as it is in Live aside from the resource cost. This still purges one beneficial magic effect from your target, but now it costs 20 Maelstrom. Overall, it seems weaker in Legion due to the simple fact that you can't spam it anymore. That's it for our Maelstrom spenders. Next up, we have Thunderstorm. This is exactly the same as it is in Draenor. This deals some light nature damage to all enemies within 10 yards of you, knocks them back, and reduces their movement speed by 40% for 5 seconds. It's also still usable while stunned. We also have Astral Shift. This has been moved from talents to a baseline ability, and it's unchanged from Draenor. This makes you take 40% less damage for 6 seconds, and it has a 1.5 minute cooldown. And we also still have Hex. This turns your target into a frog, and it can't attack or cast spells while it's active. It lasts for 1 minute, has a base 1.7 second cast, and its cooldown was reduced to 30 seconds down from the 45 seconds in Draenor. For our DPS cooldowns, we still have the Fire and Earth Elementals. They have seen some changes. The Earth Elemental now has a 2-minute cooldown, down from Draenor's 5 minutes, but its duration was also reduced to 15 seconds, down from 1 minute to compensate for that. And it behaves just like it does in Draenor. It'll taunt and tank your enemies for you. As for the Fire Elemental, he's still your damage dealer. One change is that he now also increases your Maelstrom generation while he's active. It says 1% here, but I'm sure that's just a placeholder. I'm fairly certain they're going to increase that. It still has a cooldown of 5 minutes and a duration of 1 minute. One important thing to note is that these no longer start the other elementals' cooldown. On Draenor, whenever you would summon one of these, it would trigger a 1 minute cooldown on whichever one you didn't summon. Now you can have them both out at the same time, which is nice. And we of course still have our Heroism, or Bloodlust if you're Horde. It's pretty much unchanged. This gives you and every member of your party or raid a 30% increase to haste for 40 seconds. The cooldown itself is 5 minutes, but you can only get the effect once every 10 minutes due to the exhausted debuff that is applied when you get this buff. And finally we have Ghost Wolf. This is also unchanged. This is an instant cast spell that transforms you into a Ghost Wolf, increasing your movement speed by 30%. It is worth mentioning that you retain your Maelstrom power whenever you enter and exit this form. For some reason you still have a mana bar when you're in Ghost Wolf form, but I'm pretty sure that's just a bug. That's pretty much it, for all of the important stuff anyways. Everything else I didn't mention are still functionally the same pretty much, maybe just percentage or cooldown changes. I'll mouse over them here quickly and you can pause the video if you want to see the exact numbers, but abilities I haven't mentioned yet are Ancestral Spirit, Astral Recall, Cleanse Spirit, Farsight, Water Walking, and Wind Shear. For passives we have Elemental Focus. This causes your non-periodic critical strike spells to give your next 2 spells a 10% bonus to damage. This lasts for 15 seconds and it meshes really well with the Lava Burst because as you remember, that always crits as long as you have an enemy afflicted with Flame Shock. We also have Elemental Fury, which causes your critical strikes to deal 250% damage as opposed to the standard 200% damage. So you can tell that they're really pushing for crit to be one of your main stats here. There is some really good burst potential for Elemental this expansion. Lava Surge has also seen a return. This makes your Flame Shock damage over time effect to have a 10% chance to reset the cooldown on your Lava Burst, and also make it instant cast. This will of course trigger Elemental Focus, so these two passives synergize really well with each other. And we of course still have Reincarnation, although it was nerfed a bit. This allows you to self-res once every 30 minutes, giving you 20% health when you res down from the 70% in Draenor. And finally we have our new mastery, Elemental Overload. This causes your Lightning Bolt, Elemental Blast, Chain Lightning, and Lava Burst spells to have a 35% chance to trigger a second time on your target for 75% of their normal damage, and also generate 50% of their normal Maelstrom generation. The thing that scales with the mastery here is the proc chance, so the more you stack that, the higher chance you have for that copy spell. I really like this new mastery. I think it's way better than the Draenor mastery, which was the Earthquake damage and the dot. It's sort of like a Wind Fury for spellcasters, which is awesome. I have a feeling mastery will be very important for Elemental this expansion because this seems really strong. And that's it for every ability and passive. If I didn't mention anything from Draenor, it was either moved to talents, removed entirely, or they just haven't put it back in yet. Next up I'll go over the revamped talents, and just like the abilities and passives, I'll go over every single talent here and show you them in action. I'll also have a link to the talent calculator in the description if you want to see them for yourself. For the level 15 tier, we have Path of Flame. This causes your Lava Burst to deal 10% more damage and also cause your Flame Shock to spread to a nearby enemy. There are some quirks with this. This also copies down the duration of your flame shock, so say if you have 10 seconds remaining on it and then you lava burst, your second target will also get a 10-second flame shock. It doesn't override, so say for example you copy a 10-second flame shock and then you put a fully buffed 35-second flame shock on your main target. If you then hit that target with another lava burst, it doesn't overwrite the 10-second duration flame shock that got copied earlier. Not sure if that's a bug or not, but it is something that you should know before taking this talent. Next up we have Earth and Rage. This is our old mastery, they just put it into talents. When you take this, your damaging spells cause your enemy to take some damage over 6 seconds, so just a boost to single target damage here. Lastly, for the level 15 tier, we have Totem Mastery. This summons 4 totems around you that give you different bonuses. You have the Resonance Totem, which gives you 1 Maelstrom every second. You also have the Storm Totem, which increases the chance for your Lightning Bolt to trigger Elemental Overload by 10%. Elemental Overload, if you recall, is our mastery, which gives you a chance for that double cast. It's not clear if this is additive or multiplicative. Usually if it doesn't explicitly state it, it's additive, but I can't say for sure. We also have the Ember Totem, which increases your Flame Shock's damage over time effect by 20%. And finally, the Tailwind Totem that gives you a flat 3% haste boost. This has both a duration and a cooldown of 30 seconds, so this is something that you can keep up at all times. It does have a range, however. If you move more than 40 yards from your totems, they disappear, so you gotta be careful on fights that require a lot of movement. For the level 30 tier, we have Gust of Wind. I really like this one. Think of it as a Reverse Hunter's Disengage. This causes a gust of wind to send you forward for about 10 to 15 yards, even further if you jump before using it. It's of course instant cast, and it has a cooldown of 15 seconds, and just like Disengage, it resets fall damage, so just a really good mobility spell overall. Next we have Ancestral Guidance, which has seen a return. This is pretty much unchanged. When you use this, 20% of your damage and healing is converted to healing on up to 3 nearby injured party or raid members. It has a duration of 10 seconds and a cooldown of 2 minutes, so just a nice ability to have when your healers need the help. Next up we have the Windrush Totem. This summons a low health totem at your target location, and any ally passing within 10 yards of it gets a 60% increase to movement speed for 5 seconds. The totem itself has a 15-second duration and a cooldown of 2 minutes. I'm sure this is going to be invaluable for speed trials like challenge dungeons, or just on fights that require a lot of movement from you and your allies. For the level 45 tier, we have the Lightning Surge Totem. This is basically the Capacitor Totem from Draenor. They just renamed it for some reason and threw it into the talents. This places a totem at the target location, and after 5 seconds, it stuns all enemies within 8 yards of it for 5 seconds. It has a 35-yard range and a 45-second cooldown. I guess the only difference here is that you can now place this wherever you want, as opposed to live servers where it just places it at your feet. On live servers, he also had the Totem Projection ability, which lets you move your totems wherever you wanted to, so overall it's not a huge difference, I guess. It just saves you one button press. Next up, we have the Earth Grab Totem. This used to replace the Earthbind Totem, but since we don't have that anymore, it's just a standalone ability. This summons a totem at the target location that pulses every 2 seconds, rooting enemies within 8 yards of the totem for 5 seconds. If an enemy was previously rooted, it'll slow their movement speed by 50% for 5 seconds instead. This has a 35-yard range, a 20-second duration, and a 30-second cooldown. So once again, the main difference here is the fact that you can place this at a target location instead of just at your feet. Next up, we have a new totem, and that's the Voodoo Totem. There was a lot of excitement about this when it was first announced. This replaces Hex, and you can place this just like your other totems, and any enemy within 8 yards of it will be turned into frogs just like Hex. This has a cooldown of 30 seconds and a duration of 10 seconds. The Hex itself lasts for 20 seconds, and after it's broken, the target is immune to another Hex for 15 seconds. This is a really nice AoE crowd control. One interesting thing to note is that it looks like this doesn't aggro whatever you use it on, so this is a good opener in dungeons because it allows you to crowd control everything and you can still let the tank pull. For the level 60 tier, we have Elemental Blast. This is a base 2-second cast, 12-second cooldown spell that deals some heavy elemental damage, and just like in Draenor, it increases your critical strike, haste, or mastery by a certain amount for 10 seconds. The only difference here being, of course, is that multi-strike is no longer a possibility since that's being removed in Legion. Next up, we have Ancestral Swiftness. This has been reworked. This now gives you a passive 10% increase to your haste and attack speed. In Draenor, as you may know, this used to be 5%, but it would also make your next cast instant, so it looks like we traded that function for a more powerful passive boost. Next up, we have Echo of the Elements. This gives your Lava Burst 3 charges, and other effects that would reset the cooldown, like your Lava Surge passive, now instead grant you 1 charge. This used to also affect Earthquake, but you also had a maximum of 2 charges, so we traded an ability for an extra charge for this one basically. I like this talent. It has a lot of burst potential. Also, sometimes you'll run into situations where you double up on your Lava Surge proc, so having this hold up to 3 charges sort of eliminates that waste of damage. You still lose that instant cast if you double up on your Lava Surge procs, but you still get that extra charge. It also synergizes well with our next talent in the level 75 tier, Elemental Fusion. This one boosts your Lava Surge passive, increasing its chance to proc by 10%, so that brings it to a total of a 30% chance to give you a free instant Lava Burst when your Flame Shock dot ticks. Like I said, this synergizes really well with the Echo of Elements passive because you'll be wasting less Lava Surge procs if you don't burn them immediately. Next up we have Primal Elementalist, which is seen in return. This makes your Earth, Fire, and Storm elementals 80% more powerful, unlock extra abilities, and it also allows you to take direct control of them. The Storm Elemental is in the next tier, I'll go over that later. As far as the abilities are concerned, I won't go into too much detail here for the sake of not making this video an hour long, but for the Fire Elemental it still has Fire Blast, Fire Nova, and Immolate. It looks like it traded its Empower ability for Living Bomb, which puts a bomb on an enemy and explodes for some AoE damage after 8 seconds. Empower, as you may know, used to increase all of your damage done by 5% and healing by 10% while the Elemental channeled it on you. Note that this only allows you to control your Fire and Storm elementals, not your Earth elemental, unlike Draenor where you could control all 3 of them. Next up we have Magnitude. This causes any enemy who is both standing in your Earthquake and is afflicted by Flame Shock to have magma erupt at their feet, dealing some extra damage. Once again, a pretty vague description. I did some testing and it ticks with every Earthquake totem tick, and it deals about 1/4 of the damage of every Earthquake tick, so you can think of this as a 25% increase to Earthquake totem damage if the target is afflicted by Flame Shock. Remember, your shocks no longer have cooldowns, so this stipulation is pretty easy to achieve. It just depends on how many targets you have up. Having the Path of Flame talent will make it a little easier if you took that. Next up we have Lightning Rod. When you take this, your spells have a chance to cause your target to become a lightning rod. This makes your target and any enemy within 20 yards of it take an additional 20% of the damage you dealt to it. For example, if you hit an enemy with a lightning rod for 10,000 damage, both it and every enemy next to it will take another 2,000 damage. That's what it's supposed to do at least. As of this build, it actually deals 100% of the lightning rod's damage taken to all nearby enemies. I'm pretty sure that's just a bug since that's not what the talent says, so I wouldn't count on that staying. Through some testing, it looks like it can proc off every damage spell but Earthquake Totem. And Earthquake's damage itself does not get that 20% AoE. I'm not sure if that's intended or not. The duration is 20 seconds, and it looks like the proc rate is around 10%, so it's not too high. You can have multiple lightning rods up at once though, so this is a really big boost to your AoE damage. Next up is the Storm Elemental. This saw some changes. This summons a Storm Elemental to fight for you for 1 minute, and for 15 seconds after summoning it, your Maelstrom generation is increased by 100%. It still has a cooldown of 5 minutes, and it was nerfed in the sense that it now replaces the Fire Elemental. Also, it no longer heals raid or party members equal to its damage dealt. Its primal version has the same abilities that it does in Draenor. Feel free to pause the video on these if you want to see the details, but it has Wind Gust, Call Lightning, Gale Force, and Eye of the Storm. Next up we have Aftershock. This causes your shock spells to refund 25% of the Maelstrom you spent on them. This is pretty handy. With this you don't have quite as much ramp up time for that big earth shock, and because your flame shock duration is also affected by how much Maelstrom you spend on it, I'm sure this talent will change up your rotation by quite a bit. And finally, for the level 100 tier we have Ascendance. This used to be a baseline ability. It has now unfortunately been stripped away and moved to talents, and its cooldown has been increased, so I'm sure a lot of people won't be happy with this one. This now has a 3-minute cooldown as opposed to Draenor's 2-minute cooldown, but other than that it's the same. This transforms you into a Flame Ascendant for 15 seconds, and while you're in this form, Lava Burst has no cooldown, and Chain Lightning turns into the more powerful Lava Beam. So this still gives you some crazy damage. The nerfs do seem unnecessary. I think at the very least this should still be baseline, so I don't know. It's pretty disappointing to have a baseline ability stripped away and thrown into talents. But like I said, it is alpha, so hopefully we'll see a change here. Next up we have something new, and that's Ice Fury. This is a base 2-second cast, 30-second cooldown spell that hurls frigid ice at your target, dealing some light frost damage and causing your next 4 frost shocks to deal a whopping 400% increased damage. To give you something to compare to, a 20 Maelstrom Frost Shock while this buff is active deals near the same damage as a crit Lava Burst, so it's some huge burst damage. Remember, Frost Shock is spammable now, so if you build up to 50 Maelstrom and then use this, you can throw out 4 quick Frost Shocks and deal some insane damage really quickly. I'd say this talent is amazing, not even counting the 30 Maelstrom it generates. That's just icing on the cake in my opinion. So this is very comparable with Ascendance, and it makes your rotation a little more interesting, which is always nice. And finally we have the Liquid Magma Totem. This is similar to Liquid Magma from Draenor. This puts a Magma Totem at your target location that deals some AoE damage to all nearby enemies every 3 seconds for 15 seconds, and you can make it tick faster with haste. It says the range is 0 yards, but that's just a bug obviously. I did some testing and it looks like it's around 5 yards, so it's still pretty restrictive on how close your enemies have to be. It has a 1-minute cooldown, so you have a downtime of 45 seconds. Unless I'm missing something, it really seems weak compared to Ice Fury and Ascendance, so I don't really see anyone taking this over those two talents as it stands right now. That's it for all of the talents, as of this build anyways. Next up, I'll talk about the artifacts for the Elemental Shaman, and that's the Fist of Ra-Den and the High Keeper's Ward Offhand Shield. The artifacts themselves have an ability called Stormkeeper. This has a 1-minute cooldown, and when you use it, your next 3 lightning bolts or chain lightnings deal 200% increased damage. So once again, just a ton of potential for burst damage here. You can combine this with the Ice Fury and 3 charges of your Lava Burst from your Echo of the Elements talent to just pile on the damage. These artifacts also have some interesting passives you can unlock. You can find calculators for this all over the place. I'll have a link in the description, but I'll go over the more major ones here. First up, we have Power of the Maelstrom. This causes your Lava Burst to give you a chance to make your next 3 lightning bolts overload 2 additional times. When they say overload here, they mean your mastery. So this is a really big boost to not only damage, but Maelstrom generation. When this procs, you get 4 lightning bolts per lightning bolt cast, 3 of those of course having 75% of the damage and 50% of the Maelstrom generation of your base lightning bolt. So from each cast you'll generate 25 Maelstrom, which is really good. And we also have Fury of the Storms. For this one, when you activate Stormkeeper, which is your artifact ability, a powerful lightning elemental is summoned to fight alongside you for 8 seconds. The elemental casts chain lightning on your enemies. In comparison to your chain lightning, it's around 1/3 of the damage, so not too bad. Next up we have Volcanic Inferno. This makes your Lava Burst spell have a chance to open a fissure under your target, which deals damage to all enemies within 3 yards every second for 6 seconds. The damage per tick is pretty close to a single lightning bolt, so damage-wise this is like 6 free AoE lightning bolts as long as your enemies are close enough. Big damage, but 3 yards is pretty restrictive, so positioning will be key. This also gives your Ascendance talent more value because you can spam Lava Burst over and over. We also have Elementalist, which causes your Lava Burst to reduce the cooldown of your Fire Elemental by 2 seconds. Once again, this synergizes well with Ascendance. This will increase with haste obviously, but per Ascendance you'll generally get in around 10 to 15 Lava Bursts depending on your talent choice. So that's a 20 to 30 second reduction in cooldown every 3 minutes from Ascendance alone, which isn't bad. And finally we have Static Overload, which causes your Chain Lightning to have a chance to cause all targets hit by it to receive an additional overloaded Chain Lightning. Once again, Overload is our new mastery. This one is absolutely insane if you combine it with the Lightning Rod talent. Here you can see I'm hitting just 2 target dummies, and you can see how these combo off of each other. When this trait procs, as you can see here, I hit each target 5 times for a total of 10 times with just 1 cast of Chain Lightning, which is crazy. I think AoE wise, just from this trait alone, I think the Lightning Rod talent is a must. The rest of these are pretty generic, some interesting stuff, but mainly just percentage increases to abilities and such. I'll mouse over these quickly and you could pause the video if you want to read them, and like I said, I'll have a link to that calculator in the description if you want to check them out. You don't have to choose between any of these traits, you'll be able to get them all eventually. You just need to get enough artifact power, which you'll get by questing, PvPing, raiding, and so on. And that's it for all of the abilities, talents, and artifact traits, at least for this alpha build anyways. I'm sure they'll add more or change some stuff later on, but that's okay because the purpose of this video is just to give you a basic idea of how the spec is played, and that's something that's very unlikely to change as they update the game. Now let's put all of this together. The only way to get an idea of how the spec is played is to see it in action, so as always I'll show you some basic fights here and narrate them a bit. Here are some single target fights. For talents I have the Echo of the Elements, so you'll see me with 3 charges of Lava Burst. I'm also comboing that with the Elemental Fusion talent for more free instant Lava Bursts. I also have Ice Fury as my level 100 talent, so you'll see some big Frost Shock damage here and there. The rotation is pretty simple. Just like in live, make sure you have your Flame Shock on your target before you throw out that Lava Burst. I try to use Lava Burst on cooldown to avoid capping out on charges, which can actually be tough if you took the Ice Fury talent as well. If you stop to use that along with your Frost Shocks and you're proccing Lava Surge a lot, those charges can sneak up on you, so you gotta stay on top of that or else you'll be wasting some damage. The damage is very bursty as you can see here. This is without the artifact traits as well, and as you can imagine all of those play a huge part in your gameplay. One thing I will say is that we are pretty squishy. Like I said earlier, our self-heal is kind of underpowered, and our only straight-up defensive cooldown, not including talents, is that astral shift, so you can't just sit there and tank too much or else you'll be in trouble. Next up, we have some AoE. For talents, I have Ascendance for that lava beam. I also have Lightning Rod for that big AoE boost. And I also picked up Magnitude, which as you may recall causes Earthquake to deal some extra damage to enemies afflicted by Flame Shock, so that's why I'm applying that to everything. As you can see here, I pop pretty much every cooldown in the book, both Elementals, Ascendance, Astral Shift, Ancestral Guidance, and even Heroism. The damage is great, but the problem I run into is the amount of damage that I take. I'm doing too much damage for my Earth Elemental to really hold aggro, so everything is hitting me. You'll even see me throw out some heals here and there. But damage-wise, as you can see, it's pretty nuts. We're in a really good spot in both AoE and single target at the moment, which is nice. And here's a longer single target fight. My talents are pretty much the same as my shorter single target fights, except I also picked up the Storm Elemental since I wanted to show that in action for you guys. I didn't pop Heroism for this since I only really needed that for the AoE fight. I start off this one with the Flame Shock, which is standard, and follow that up with 3 Lava Bursts so I don't waste those Lava Surge procs. I try to save Ice Fury for when I'm near 50 Maelstrom because remember, that generates 30 Maelstrom and buffs your next 4 Frost Shocks, which take 20 Maelstrom each if you want to get the full damage out of them. Other than that, it's just a matter of keeping up with your procs, keeping your Flame Shock up, and dumping your Maelstrom on Earth Shock once you cap out. When both Lava Surge and Ice Fury are on cooldown, that's a good time to use Stormkeeper to sort of fill out that gap in damage. And that's pretty much it. Hopefully you have a better understanding and feel of how the Elemental Shaman's core gameplay works. It's a really fun spec, I think. It's incredibly bursty. That's one of the things I love about Shamans. If everything lines up and you get the right procs, you can deal some pretty insane damage. I remember back in the old days in vanilla World of Warcraft where Wind Fury could proc off of itself and basically one-shot people if you were lucky enough. Like I said, Shaman is not my main class and I haven't played it in a while, so I'm not sure how they've evolved since vanilla, but it looks like we're getting an echo of that back in Legion, which is really cool, I think. There is room for improvement though. As I mentioned earlier, there are some things in the talents that were a little disappointing, but it is alpha, so things are always subject to change. The class identity feels great. Channeling a variety of different elements to take down your enemies is the essence of what an elemental shaman should be, and they really nailed it in this expansion in my opinion. I had a lot of fun playing it and making this video for you, so this spec is definitely a contender for my main class once this expansion hits. If you want to see more elemental gameplay, I also did a full dungeon run. No commentary on that though, just some raw gameplay for those of you who want to see more of what this spec is capable of. I'll have an annotation for that right here and a link in the description if you want to see that. And as always, feel free to leave me a message about your opinion on the state of Elemental for Legion, especially all of you who main this spec. Like I said, my opinion is from a very casual viewpoint. I like to hear a pro's perspective on how this class is changing and if you think it's for the better or for the worse. Whether or not you like the changes, I hope you at least found this video informative, interesting, or entertaining in some way. Like I said, I had a lot of fun making it, and I hope you had a lot of fun watching it. Thanks for checking it out. I'll be doing guides like this for every spec for every class in the game, so keep an eye out for those if you're interested. And if you have any feedback or suggestions, feel free to leave me a message. There's always room for improvement. Once again, I'll have a poll up in the description if you would like to vote on the next class. Once again, no tanking or healing classes yet, but hopefully you can find a spec in there that you would like to see. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. Give it a like if you liked it, and if you really liked it, let me know in the comments and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching, good luck, and peace!